For this video, I'm going to review the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed in 1713. In this video, I'm going to talk about trading relationships leading up to the treaty, during and after, the Wabanaki Confederacy in the eastern Algonquin region, and the treaty itself, and then the time period after between 1713 and 1723. So first, as we know, up until this point, the French and the British have been working relatively respectively with the First Nations in Canada because that relationship is needed, and both the British and the French value the knowledge that they gain from the First Nations. So as long as they are needed, they are being respected. And we're getting to a point now where the knowledge of how to work the land, how to develop the resources, how to trade, is being passed down through the British and French generations as being sort of their knowledge. The history of where that knowledge came from is starting to be lost. So that idea of needing the First Nations and respecting them is starting to not become as solid. And the idea of land. Now that we're establishing borders and the British and the French are establishing regions and this is British land and this is French land, there's displacement that's starting to happen where the British and the French are starting to move First Nations peoples off of their traditional land. And for a couple of reasons. One, because they want to claim the land as belonging to their country, and they want to bring over new settlers to settle in that land, to sort of take control. And even though the boundaries have changed, and even though who technically is in charge of the land, who lives on the land hasn't changed. And this is a difficult concept. So when the British take over around the St. Lawrence and the eastern part of Canada, it's still a French colony in practice. There are still French farmers there, French settlers there, French businesses there. It's governed by, and the boundary is, it's now part of British territory. But the British are not going to displace the French because it's already a functioning community. It's already a strong economy. But because the First Nations in the region they don't have a community that is recognized by the British. They don't have an economy that is recognized by the British. It's easier to displace them than it is to displace the French. So for a couple of reasons, that's why the First Nations are being displaced and moved to different areas that are not their traditional lands. And in this time, there was these alliances between the French and the First Nations, but Britain is in control of those regions now. So those trading relationships are becoming strained because the First Nations who are originally trading partners with the French are now residing in sort of British land, and there's a conflict now between the British and the French. All right, which leads to the Wabanaki Confederacy. So the Wabanaki Confederacy was made up of 5 First Nations peoples, 5 groups of First Nations peoples in the eastern, sort of the eastern Iroquois region of Canada, so the east coast of Canada. And there was one specific group, that the Wabanaki, who were in Acadia, Newfoundland. And after the Treaty of Utrecht, Britain takes control of Newfoundland and Acadia, and there's conflict, because there's been a long-standing alliance between the Wabanaki nations, Wabanaki Confederacy, and the French. So at first, the British are trying to displace these First Nations peoples and encouraging them to go and live in French colonies, go live in the area of Canada that is still French. But the French are encouraging the Wabanaki Confederacies to stay in British regions, because then they kind of have an alliance, they kind of have French people in those regions. It's the First Nations groups are being used as pawns in this. So what ends up happening is there are a strong group of the Wabanaki who remain in British-controlled regions, and they resist and they fight against the British. They take over trading posts, they reclaim settlements. There's absolute conflict. And the British, because they are so outnumbered they realized that there's nothing more they can do to ally with the French. They own the land, but they need to rebuild this relationship with the Wabanaki Confederacy to sort of sever the ties with the French. So they decide to establish the Treaty of Portsmouth. So the Treaty of Portsmouth was designed to break alliances between the Wabanaki Confederacy and the French and to strengthen relationships between the Wabanaki and the British. So in this Treaty of Portsmouth, it's named Treaty of Portsmouth because it was signed in Portsmouth, the British promised to do not build any new settlements in Acadia that are on Wabanaki traditional lands. They agree to trade in neutral locations so that it's not a British colony or a French colony, it's more of a neutral so that the Wabanaki can trade with anyone. And they agreed to honor the tradition of giving gifts with a treaty and the idea that a treaty is a working document or a working agreement that you need to continue to work at and revisit. The Wabanaki agreed to stop attacks on the British, their trading posts, their fishing stations. They agreed to return the settlements that they, during resistance, took after the Treaty of Utrecht. And here's the interesting one. They agree to have all future disputes between the Wabanaki and the British be solved by the British government, which, in a sense, kind of makes the Wabanaki Confederacy under British rule. Now, the Treaty of Portsmouth was written in English. There were translators there to translate the treaty to the representatives of the 5 First Nations peoples within the Wabanaki Confederacy. But you have to consider how well this was understood, especially the aspect that they are now sort of under control and decisions will be made by the British government, which traditionally isn't part of their tradition. And even the actual signing of the treaty, the British government had it written out and everyone had to sign it, whereas the Wabanaki Confederacy, that's not their tradition of a treaty. A treaty is an oral agreement, and so the information is passed down orally, which is why it needs to be revisited and spoken of. So just the fact that these two groups came together and actually physically signed a treaty is an interesting part of history. Now, the British don't honor their side of the treaty at all. And very soon after signing the Treaty of Portsmouth, they begin bringing in settlers and settling on Wabanaki territory and their traditional hunting grounds. And so, in consequence, the Wabanaki do not abide to their side of the treaty, and they begin attacking and resisting against the British. So they attack a fishing station in Acadia, and then for the next 10 years, between 1713 and 1723, there's this ongoing conflict. Now here's where it gets tricky. The British government are never really sure if it's the Wabanaki Confederacy working on its own or if they're working as military alliances with the French. And there's documentation and sources such as both sides. So there are letters that suggest that the French are supplying the weapons to the Wabanaki Confederacy for the conflict to protect themselves and to defeat the British. But there's also documentation to say that the French have nothing to do with the attacks and that the Wabanaki Confederacy are working on their own and independently. Regardless of which is true, this time of conflict raises tension between the French and the British. And the First Nations of the region are really caught up in the middle. This time period before this and after this is there are a great deal of displacements, murders, collecting First Nations and making them slaves. It's a time of great turmoil. And it's thought of a time of conflict between the French and the British, but the First Nations of Canada at the time really get caught up in these conflicts, and they are probably the largest, they suffer the greatest loss in all of these conflicts.